welcome at the Diplomatic Academy for our new edition of our series, International Rivers and International Conflicts, Rivers in International Politics. We started this series with the Nile issue and then with the Mekong, mainly Delta. Today, we are talking about a river which even has more than one name. It's either Rio Grande or Rio Bravo. And we will discuss all the issues that we can cover within 90 minutes on the contestations, international contestations, because this is a topic that we always want to discuss, that are concerned with the Rio Grande. And I'm happy that this will be moderated by Professor Nicholas Cullather, who has an experience working with the Diplomatic Academy. Welcome. He was actually, until quite recently, our Fulbright professor at the Diplomatische Akademie in Vienna. And I welcome also especially our speakers who will be introduced by Professor Cullather. Just let me say, when we organize a series, are always surprised how much border issues can be discussed in a sensible and also an academic way when one looks at big rivers. And the Rio Grande, to my mind, is a very special case because, as you will hear during this meeting, a lot has been made policy-wise, but also academically, on the water management and water resource issues of the Rio Grande, which are highly important and topical issues. But not so much has so far been done on the academic side, as far as I know, on these other political issues, especially concerning narcotic smuggle. And I have to say, most that I know about Rio Grande and narcotics trade comes from Netflix series, where you have the discussion about what sort of cartel is using the crossing of the river to make money, and how on the US side, there is this famous Department of Narcotics Administration, or whatever it is called. And the second issue is an issue for media, certainly, the issue of migration, which again is not a new one concerning the Rio Grande and Rio Bravo. This maybe you may call it even already the Native Americans, what we in German call the Indianer. They had the issues with the crossing migration streams across the Rio Grande. And certainly in the last few weeks, we all read in international media about the issue of the up to 15,000 Haitians who are migrants at the moment, or partly at the moment, on the American side of the Rio Grande, and being flown back by the Biden administration in spite of a different regime as far as border management is concerned than the Trump administration. And these are all political issues which I think show that the river is actually, in the case of the Rio Grande, and that's my thesis before I leave you with Professor Cullather, that the river is separating two worlds in the case of the Rio Grande. But I guess our expert will tell us, as far as water management is concerned, I am absolutely wrong. Professor Cullather, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ambassador Brix, and thank you to the Diplomatic Academy for arranging this event. The river does divide both countries, but it also connects them. Its watershed is nearly equally split between the United States and Mexico. And it stretches as far north as Colorado and south into Chihuahua, Nuevo León, and 5 other Mexican states. It passes through strikingly different ecological zones. Beginning from snowmelt in the high mountains, it flows through deep canyons, across scorching deserts, and through lush subtropical regions. It discharges into the Gulf of Mexico with a volume that varies from as high as 27,300 cubic meters per second to less than 1 cubic meter per second. And the water itself changes along the way. It comes out of the San Juan Mountains and it's fresh, with a salt content below that of bottled water you might find in a store. But by the time it gets to El Paso, briny water percolating through faults has given it a distinctly salty taste, which limits its usefulness for agricultural irrigation or for municipal drinking water, even as the demand for water increases. Like other international rivers covered by this series, it's subject to international governance and, at times, international dispute. Here to help us understand the river and its controversies are Dr. Luzma Fabiola Nava, researcher at the Center for Global Change and Sustainability in Tabasco, Mexico. She is also a guest research scholar at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Luxembourg, Austria. And with her is Professor Gabriel Eckstein of the Texas A&M University School of Law and director of the Energy, Environmental, and Natural Resource Systems Law program there, and also president of the International Water Resources Association. Dr. Nava, Professor Eckstein, thank you and welcome. Set the scene for us, if you will, Dr. Nava. Can you tell us about the river's physical characteristic, what it looks like, what its characteristics are?
Yes, thank you, Professor Cullather, for the invitation, and to the Diplomatische Akademie. I would like to say that first, the US and Mexico share nearly a 300 kilometers long border that crosses three major rivers. First one, the Colorado River, second, the Tijuana River, and third, the Rio Grande or Rio Bravo River. In that case, the Rio Grande River is longest of these rivers. I mean, longest from the Colorado and the Tijuana River, and the Rio Grande forms the international boundary for more than 2,000 kilometers between the US and Mexico. The Rio Grande is one of the largest rivers in the world. It carries, but it carries less water than rivers of similar size because it runs through arid areas for most of its length. The headwaters of the Rio Grande Bravo are located in the US state of Colorado, as you already mentioned. The river flows south through New Mexico, arriving well south of the city of Albuquerque at two major reservoirs on its course, Elephant Butte and Caballo Dams. Downstream of this, the flow almost entirely depends on releases from reservoirs. Starting from the cities of Ciudad Juarez in Mexico and El Paso, Texas, until its mouth, the Rio Grande forms the international border between Texas and 4 Mexican states. The river basin is shared almost in half between the two countries. But mainly because of the semi-arid climate and the extensive withdrawal of water for irrigation, the flow of the river in the section downstream of Ciudad Juarez and El Paso, this is where the boundary between Mexico and the United States starts, is severely depleted, and it's called the Forgotten Ridge. In general, the Rio Grande Basin is characterized by a low level of rainfall and a high load of pollutants, leading to a dilemma of water scarcity and diminished water quality. These problems are intensified by population and economic growth, which together drive competition between users and degrade the riparian ecosystem.
It sounds like a river that's very much under strain. I wonder, Professor Eckstein, if you could tell us a little bit about the human environment there, the population that is putting such pressure on that river.
Sure. So thank you, first of all, Dr. Cullather, and to the Diplomatic Academy for organizing this session and for inviting me to participate. It's a very complicated picture in terms of the human environment. If you're looking at the border region, there's always a question of, how far away from the border do you count the environment, the people, the communities, the industries, and so on. So you have this, as Luzma explained, the 4 states on the U.S. side and 6 total states on the Mexican side. There's about 30 million people, if you're counting about 100 miles, 160 kilometers from either side of the border. We're talking about 30 million people who are in that border region, about 20 million on the US side, 10 or 11 million on the Mexican side. in the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo region, it's it is, as Luzma was saying, it's more than half of the total U.S.-Mexico border. There's probably on the U.S. side about 3.5 million individuals living in that, and it's pretty much the Texas area. And I don't know actually on the Mexican side in that region, but there's also just in the El Paso, Ciudad Juarez, just on the Ciudad Juarez side, there's almost 2 million people there in just that municipal area. Now, of this, 30 million people, majority are found in what we call sister city communities. There's about 14 sister city communities on the border. El Paso, Ciudad Juarez, I mentioned. There's also the San Diego, Tijuana, and a few others. But there's also smaller communities, villages, towns that are in between all along the border, certainly all along the Rio Grande. But it's a very vast expanse. I have to note that the communities in this region don't always look at it from the way some of us who live further away look at it. We look at it as a border, as a political border with communities on both sides. And in fact, many of these communities are very integrated. Families crossing the border, businesses crossing the border every day. Now, of course, not so much under the COVID conditions, but in the past, people would cross the border for breakfast. They would cross the border for their dentist. They would cross the border for soccer games and family and social events and so on. So it's a very mixed community that looks at their border communities without really seeing much of the physical border the way some of us who live further away might look.
I think we had an example of that last week. I think it was the Interior Secretary referred to the border as closed. And the news organizations immediately kind of jumped in and showed pictures of people strolling across bridges in the manner that you're describing, going there for lunch. So I was impressed by something Dr. Nava said about the fact that the most of the water for the river is released from reservoirs in one or the other country. I've heard the river described as being fully used. What does that mean exactly in terms of the ecology of the river, in terms of the way, in general terms, in terms of the way the politics plays out?
Well, indeed, the river is fully used, which means that the river is heavily managed and allocated basin. And I think there are mainly 5 reasons here. First, the water of the Rio Grande Basin is allocated within a binational legal framework that allocates water resources, sets extraction and diversions, and sustains political boundaries between the 2 countries. Second, the majority of surface water rights are fully adjudicated. And this situation is the same in the United States and in Mexico. And this means that there are no more rights to water than water normally available. Third, an estimate of 85% of surface water in the basin is allocated to agricultural use. This is the primary and the priority use within the basin. Allocations to each country, this is the 4th reason, allocations to each country are based on an estimate of basin hydrology at the time decisions were made. And this is from last century. And these decisions these numbers have remained unchanged despite a substantial increase in municipal, industrial, and agricultural water demands, multiple coexisting water users. And finally, the current effects of climate change on water resources translate into perspective critical to sustain. Besides, climate change intensifies or has intensified the effects on the stream flow, temperature, snowfall, and snowpack, and rainfall. Also, climate change adds to the existing tensions among stakeholders and mobilize them mainly from the agricultural sector to discuss alternative programs and policies to continue receiving the water that they are right to have in order to fully satisfy the agricultural needs and the production of food.
Mm-hmm.
If I may, can I jump in on this? Just something just to add, which I don't know if people understand when we talk about a river being fully allocated, it's always in relation to the available water. And in some years you have more, in some years you have less. And you have what we call paper rights. People have rights to use a certain amount of water, but if there's not that amount in the river, the people who, some people cannot get their water rights. And the situation on the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo, is that in some years, because of drought, because of overuse and overexploitation, the river actually doesn't reach the Gulf of Mexico. It stops. There's been a number of years where the river has just died before reaching the Gulf. And you have to question, is this still a river if it doesn't reach its terminus?
Yeah. And it sounds as if the water is released into it from reservoirs on either side, according to the terms of earlier agreements. Can we talk a little bit about those agreements? How far back do they go, and what do they say?
Would you like me to jump in on?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So there are treaties on the border going back into the 1800s. If we're looking at treaties that allocate the river, probably the two main ones are the 1906 treaty and the 1944 treaty. The 1906 treaty focused primarily on what we call the upper basin, which is north of the El Paso Sierra de Juarez, and it does allocate a certain amount for the U.S. basically guarantees a certain amount of water that is going to reach the border on the Rio Grande and is allocated to Mexico. The 1944 treaty then takes over below that point all the way to its terminus and allocates the waters between the two countries. It allocates the water that's in the main stem of the river, but also tributaries. So certain tributaries, the water go to one side or the other, and some tributaries, they actually divide. So for example, most of the tributaries on the Mexican side are divided 2/3, 1/3 in terms of water being allotted to Mexico versus water being allotted to the United States. So this is the regime we have in place in terms of water allocation.
I would like to add something here. Just to say, thank you. Just to say that the 1944 Water Treaty also applies for the Colorado River. And this is very important in the context of this treaty. Do not forget also the situation from the other side of the border. There is the Colorado River, which is also included in the terms of the 1944 Water Treaty. So both rivers are allocated within this treaty.
Yeah. Which makes for a very complicated scenario. In one treaty, you're dealing with rivers that are on different sides of the countries. So,
wow. So in diplomatic terms, we should really view the entire border region as a unit in this sense?
I suppose in diplomatic terms, yes, but you have to be careful because you're not necessarily negotiating what we call apples for oranges. You're not negotiating the waters on the Colorado in relation to the waters in the Rio Grande. Each river has its own allocation scheme, which is independent. Now, in reality, I'm sure there was some back and forth in terms of, if we give you this much on this river, you can get that much on that river. I'm sure there was some kind of negotiations that brought in those kinds of issues, and probably other issues that were not water related. But as a practical matter, the rivers are very separate hydrological units and have to be considered separately, even though they're governed by the same document and instruments.
Yeah. And it's also important to say, I'm sorry, it's also important to say that the 1944 treaty applies only for the section in the case of the Colorado River that crosses the border. And in the case of the Rio Grande or Rio Bravo Basin, the section of the river running along the border.
Yeah.
That means that the whole basin from the United States to the Gulf of Mexico or the Gulf of California in the Colorado River is not covered. I mean, the treaty is only about the surface water crossing the border, the Colorado River, or running along the border, the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo Basin.
This is a great point, because there's a big difference legally and politically when you think of what's called a successive river, a river that crosses from one country into another, like the Colorado, or a river that is along the border, like the Rio Grande is, in terms of how you manage it, in terms of how you decide who has rights to it. So I think it's a really critical point in understanding the governance of these two river basins.
And you've been talking about surface water only so far. Does the regime govern groundwater?
No. Oh, that's a tricky question. The short answer is no, but at least certainly not under the 1906 treaty doesn't have anything about groundwater. The 1944 treaty doesn't mention groundwater. And there's a debate going on, and it's been going on for a number of years, whether somehow it might apply to groundwater. In fact, so the 1944 treaty has what's called the minute system, which are, by some ideas, they're interpretations that apply to modern situations. By other perceptions, people say they're actually amendments. The US government and Mexican government doesn't like to use the word amendment. But the point is, there are at least 2 or 3 of these minutes that I can think of that are specific to groundwater. And although it's not mentioned in the 44 treaty, the minutes do refer to groundwater specifically. And there is a debate now going on whether maybe it should cover at least indirectly. And there's a lot of question about whether we need to add some kind of addition to the 44 treaty or a separate treaty about groundwater.
Mm-hmm. Groundwater is becoming important all around the world. Am I right in thinking it's becoming more crucial to the economy of this region as well?
Luzma, do you want to start, or I
can? Please go ahead.
Yeah. So the short answer is yes. There are communities throughout the border region that are 100% dependent on groundwater because they have no other source. Now, in the Rio Grande Basin, obviously, that's not the case, but there is still significant dependency on groundwater for communities in the region, and also hydrological relationship between those aquifers and the Rio Grande. So this is something that has to be taken into account. And we've not fully computed the economic value, the human impact the groundwater has on these communities, on the economy, but this is something that is subject to ongoing research.
Dr. Nava, last October, about this time of year, there was a major protest in Mexico in which farmers occupied a dam in order to thwart the release of water into the Rio Grande. Can we expect something similar this year? Or I wonder if you could talk about that, the tensions between the public in Mexico and the obligations under this treaty.
Yes, yes, exactly. That was a situation almost exactly last year ago, where Mexico and the United States have this obligation to release water to each other at a certain time of the year and from certain point. And in that case, because of climate change and because of the low level of precipitation, the reservoirs from the Mexican side where water has to be released to the United States weren't foolish. So the farmers from the state of Chihuahua, which is the upstream state in this international basin, were arguing that water, because water was in its territory, belongs to them. But here there is an important situation worth to mention. First, that this international treaty, which is the 1944 water treaty, has a higher level than the own Mexican constitution. So that means that even the president wasn't in the position to say we won't release any water to the United States because of the treaty. So that means that this water had to be released to the US. And it was very, very interesting because the farmers or the users downstream in this international basin, which are located in Tamaulipas, were reclaiming the water from the Chihuahua state. And they were also saying, we don't have to give any water to the United States. And this means that they weren't understanding this binational obligation to distribute water to the United States. So that is called, and this situation was framed within the 5 cycle period of the 1944 treaty, which means that in a period of 5 years, Mexico and the United States have to release a certain amount of water. That could be the first year they can release 30% of the total amount of water. The second year they can release 20%, and so far until within the 5 years they complete the full amount of water. So last year was the last of that period of 5 years, and that was one more reason why these disputes were more intensified by two countries.
If I could follow up on that a little bit, I understand that the United States said that for humanitarian reasons, they would loan some water to Mexico. Both of those terms strike me as very interesting diplomatically and politically. First of all, to say that releasing the water was for humanitarian reasons, I'm not sure what that means. And secondly, to loan water. The presumption seems to be that the water belongs to the United States, but how would it be loaned? How would it be repaid?
So the condition, yeah. So the conditions under which they would have been loaned for humanitarian reasons, it was actually not done. It was a backup in case there wasn't enough water in the system because of the precipitation and so on. Well, let me back up. Because of what Luzma just described, the situation, Mexico eventually repaid that debt by transferring water rights in reservoirs that the two countries share that are right on the Rio Grande. So these are binational reservoirs, Amistad and Falcon. And they basically, it said, U.S., this portion is ours, but we're not going to transfer to you. What the U.S. said was, if in a month or 2 or 3 before the rains come downstream, you run dry, we will, loan to you water from, our amount of water that's in the reservoirs for humanitarian reasons, so that people downstream on the Mexican side, but of course also on the U.S. side, have enough water for their needs, whether it's for daily needs or for agricultural use and so on. They couched it in terms of humanitarian language, but it was really a backup in case the rains didn't come and there was not enough water. There was no actual release of that water.
And also in this case, it is important to say that Professor Eckstein already mentioned the minute system. So this situation from last year was solved within the framework of the minute 325. And as today, there are already 326 minutes, which means that 326 times the 1944 treaty has been adapted to tackle very punctual issues. And the issue from last year was a very important one.
Very interesting. Let's complete the diplomatic roundup here. The La Paz Agreement, what was that?
La Paz Agreement. Yes, La Paz Agreement was, I think it dates from 1983, and it settles what we call the region. The region is an area 100 north 100 south of the border of the United States and 100 kilometers north of Mexico. So that area of 200 kilometers long is called the region. And at that time, the presidents in place thought about this area as an area to maintain and to sustain in environmental terms. That was the purpose of the 1983 La Paz Agreement. And then back in, I have the date here, if you allow me, I think it was in 2020, it became, no, in 1922, by national environmental officials released the Integrated Environmental Plan for the Mexican-US border area, and they call it the Border 21 Program. And that program focused on environmental information resources, natural resources, and environmental health. This is the context of the 1983 La Paz Agreement between Mexico and the US.
Yeah, interesting. So you were saying that the regime, its processes and rules are adapted fairly regularly. What would you say, 600 times?
326.
326 times. That's a lot of times. Who does that? What's the process? And
so,
who's in?
Yeah, so this is done. It starts off really from the International Boundary Waters Commission, and the commission it's considered a single entity, but has two offices: the American side and the Mexican side. The American side is based in El Paso. The Mexican side is based in Ciudad Juarez. But as I said earlier, I mean, the crossing of the border, it's fairly regular. And they have meetings back and forth. Of course, today, many of the meetings are by Zoom, but previously they were crossing the border very regularly for unofficial or side meetings between the two sections. And the two sections are tasked to work together to manage the entire border area, not just on water issues, but other border issues that arise, although not into things like migration. It's really much more of the physical border, where is the boundary, and also the environment, some environmental issues, and then the biggest issue is really the water issue. And so the minutes are, as Luzma was saying, that there are adaptations to the original 1944 treaty because it maybe did not conceptualize the new issues that are coming up. The two sides get together, come up with an arrangement, then they take it to their federal governments. And it's a really interesting scenario that I've not seen in, I don't think, anywhere else. When they take those instruments to their federal governments, if the federal governments do not negate them, they effectively become an official minute. So they have 30 days to not negate them. So if the federal government just sits and ignores or doesn't do anything with them, they become official, which is it's sort of an interesting way of doing business and adding to an existing treaty regime. But once they are adopted formally, those minutes are effectively part of that 1944 treaty. So we have 325 call it adjustments, amendments, interpretations, however you want to characterize them. But they are dealing with everything from salinity in the water to water allocations to water quality to border, the river moving, shifting, all sorts of issues.
And also, I would like to add that the IBWC, or the SILA in Spanish, has jurisdiction only on the border section and water issues. So any issue upstream within the territory of the United States is not of the jurisdiction of the International Boundary Water Commission. It's only boundary issues and surface water.
We have a question. This is from Mojes Teshome, who's one of our students. And he asks, what are the international roles and norms and institutions in managing water conflicts within the Rio Grande Basin? Are there any lessons to draw from the experience of the U.S.-Mexico water management and dispute resolution mechanisms for the Middle East? and for the Nile River Basin. So he's linking our discussion to the previous forums on this, on the big rivers. So that takes us in two directions. One is, are there international norms? Are there UN resolutions, for instance, that have a governing effect in the Rio Grande Basin? And then secondarily, the question of, this water regime seems quite unique to the Rio Grande. Does it provide any lessons that could possibly be applied elsewhere, or maybe are being applied elsewhere?
Luzma, do you want to begin, or?
I will give you the floor. Please go ahead.
Okay. So there's a lot there. So first, international legal norms. The short answer is yes, there are international legal norms that could be applicable to the border disputes. They haven't really been utilized. There hasn't been a need to come in and say, the UN Watercourses Convention principles or what's under customary international law, because they haven't really been needed, because the regime that we have in place especially under the 1944 treaty, provides quite a bit of opportunity and flexibility for the two countries to engage with each other and to resolve any kinds of disputes. And I'll give you a couple of examples. The commissioners of the two sections of the IBWC and CELA, the two sections of this commission, they both, under the terms of the commission, have to be engineers. They're not diplomats. They're not politicians. They're not lawyers. And so it's a very technocratic organization, which to some extent removes some of the politics out of the process. And secondly, we mentioned the minute system. The minute system starts off as a technocratic solution to whatever issues come up, practical issues, not political. The two sides get together and they say, we have water pollution, we have water allocation, we have the border shifting, the river shifting, we have whatever the issue is, and they come up with some kind of solution in the form of a minute, or sometimes in other forms that are even what I would call less than a formal minute, some kind of arrangement. And then it goes through the process that's, if it's a formal minute, it has to go again, as I said, to the two governments for approval or what I should say, not disapproval to become formal. And that creates a lot of flexibility for cooperation. Sometimes the minutes take time to negotiate, but again, they're being negotiated by a much more technocratic group of people as opposed to politicians and diplomats. So I think that's what has really kept the relationship on such good terms, not always, perfect terms, but in comparison to other basins around the world, the relationship between U.S. and Mexico on the border with regard to the border management, border location, the water management, water allocations, those have actually been really quite stable and consistent for decades.
Dr. Nava, do you have anything to add?
Yes, just something very shortly. I will say that despite the fact that we have a treaty that dates from 1944, last year, most of 100 years ago, almost. I think that the minute process is the evolving aspect of this treaty, and I think that there are several UN or international agreements that, as Professor Gabriel already mentioned, could be of help to solve some other important issues between US and Mexico. And I think that both countries have done a very interesting job in that matter, because a clear example is the minute from last year, the 325. I think the international human right to water has inspired also this minute, because as you already mentioned, it mentions that water will belong from the United States to Mexico for humanitarian purposes. And this relates us or make us think about the the UN human right to water. So it might not be so explicit, but somehow there is some UN aspects that have been already put into practice to solve water issues between Mexico and the US.
Go back to groundwater for a second. Are there international laws or UN resolutions that seek to govern groundwater allocation or pollution?
Yeah. So there is a process that has been ongoing at the UN since the early 2000s to conceptualize what an instrument like that might look like. And in 2008, the UN International Law Commission presented the UN General Assembly with what's called the draft articles on the law of transboundary aquifers. So these are principles that the International Law Commission thought would be useful for the General Assembly to look at and consider. Are these the principles we want for managing transboundary aquifers? If they are they formulated in the right way? Is this a package that could form a brand new international treaty, or are these simply guidelines? This is something that's been ongoing at the UN for, as I said, since 2008. The draft articles will be on the UN's General Assembly's agenda again in October of 2022. So that's something that is out there. To your question, is there any kind of international law for transboundary aquifers? I have to say that not yet. We see trends in that direction, but there's not a lot of experience with managing aquifers that cross international political boundaries. We have somewhere in the area of 3,600 treaties on surface waters from the last 1,200 years. We have only 7 treaties for groundwater, and they all have been implemented in the last 30 years. So our experience level with transboundary aquifers is quite limited when compared with transboundary rivers. We're still learning, and so that's why my answer is we see trends, but there still is not a fully developed body of international law for transboundary groundwater resources.
That's interesting. Let's take a look at the larger diplomatic environment. What used to be called the North American Free Trade Agreement, it's now called the U.S., Mexico, Canada Trade Agreement, or something like that. But the international agreement that creates a free trade zone in North America, has that had an effect on the Rio Grande Valley in population and uses, in the strain on the river?
Well, yes, I think that in the population growth and economic development and industrialization, of course, it has have a very important impact within the region. But it's also important to mention that within what we used to call the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was replaced by the United States-Mexico-Canada the agreement, which entered into force last year in July. Within this treaty, even the original version, which is the NAFTA, in 1944, that was important to say, that day which this treaty entered into force, there was a great mobilization, mostly in Canada, opposing to the agreement, mainly because of its implicit threats to the importation and exportation of massive transfers of water. And at this time, in 1944, mainly socio-environmental stakeholders or NGOs feared Canada will be obliged to export water through the thirsty and dry south of the US, and vice versa. The US could import water from Canada and Mexico could do exactly the same. This never happened, but in this case, it is important to mention that in parallel to the free trade agreement, which is the NAFTA or the UMSCA, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, there is an environmental agreement And this agreement is called the Agreement on Environmental Cooperation among the governments of the United States of America and the United Mexican States and Canada. And this environmental agreement, which is, let's say, managed or put into practice by the Environmental Cooperation Commission, which is based in Montreal, Canada, mentioned that, yes, water may be sold within the three countries, but only as a bottled water and shall not exceed 20 liters per container. In this case, talking about water being sold or subject to commerce, to trade, the Rio Grande, I believe, did not suffer any consequence. But thinking about the industrialization, the rise of more industries, the rise of maquiladoras in that region, of course, the river was more stressed because of the higher demand on water, mostly within the border region. And this is the 100 kilometers south of the United States and 100 kilometers north of Mexico. In that region, yes, the river was has been stressed about water uses.
The agreements, when they were formulated, I'm imagining that they stressed agricultural and drinking water uses. But has industry become a major consumer of water?
It certainly has become a serious consumer of water. Luzma just mentioned the maquiladoras you have on the Mexican side. You have growing industry on the U.S. side. In the Rio Grande basin, especially in the lower Rio Grande, you have the extensive agriculture. And as trade it expands, that creates more opportunity for agriculture to grow. Well, as agriculture grows, that puts a greater strain on the water resources. And in the Rio Grande, obviously it's a stress on the river, but also on the aquifers that underlie, because in many cases the farmers are pumping from groundwater. So it has had a significant impact. Now, we can't always quantify it because we're not metering, which is a problem. We're not metering all of these aquifers, for example, the withdrawals from groundwater, the withdrawals from the river, the Rio Grande. We do have a general sense of how much water is being extracted because we have all the water rights being managed. But it has definitely put a strain on the entire system.
Let's talk about pollution in the river. Is that governed by international agreement, or is that under the jurisdiction of separate national laws on each side?
I will say both. Each Mexican state, it is in Texas mainly, they have their own pollution laws, programs, and regulations. But also within the binational context, the IBWC, by means of the minute system, address pollution, very punctual pollution issues. So yes.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I will add to this answer that these other international programs between Mexico and the United States, as the NAT Bank, or I don't recall exactly the names, Professor Gabriel, maybe you can help me. They really focus on pollution issues within the border.
Yeah. Has it been a significant issue along the border? Is there some substantial environmental degradation? I know that it's a unique ecological region. The Big Bend area has national parks on both sides of the river. Yeah. Is that under threat?
The region is under threat from pollution. I would have to say that it's more, at least municipal pollution is coming more from the Mexican side, because we have fewer treatment facilities on the Mexican side. But the IBWC has stepped in and has engaged both sides to create water treatment facilities on the Mexican side. In some cases, they're taking the the effluent to the U.S. side and treating it. In some cases, they've helped build structures on the facilities on the Mexican side, but the level of regulation does differ. On the U.S. side, we do have regulations under Texas law and under federal U.S. law that are pretty strict in terms of what can go into the river, what kind of waste or pollution can go into the river. On the Mexican side, you have the states and the federal regulatory scheme, but my sense is that it is much more challenging on the Mexican side, in part because of resources. To build a wastewater treatment facility or a freshwater treatment facility is a significant expense. And so a lot of this does get into the river. Now, of course, there is, as I said, especially in that lower Rio Grande Valley, there's a lot of agriculture. And these are all non-point source pollution situations. And they're not regulated very much on either side. And so you have pesticides and herbicides and fertilizer that's reaching the river. And as you said, in the Big Bend area and other segments of the Rio Grande, there have been considerable pollution impacts on the riverine environment, also specifically on the aquatic ecosystem, on fish and salamanders and so on, snails. There have been efforts by groups like World Wildlife Fund and some other non-governmental groups to try to restore the river segments. But this is something that is ongoing and needs a lot more work. It really does need a lot more work. Part of it is simply pollution, absolutely, but part of it is just simply quantity. Water, there's just not enough water in the river to support the natural environment in these regions.
I would like to add something to that. I think there is an important issue that we haven't talked about the pollution or even groundwater issues. I think there is an important difference between both countries, how they measure pollution. I mean, the values might be higher in the United States to say this water or this area is polluted, but in Mexico, maybe those values doesn't mean anything yet, because Mexico has lower values to say this area is being polluted. So that's one major issue. And also, this issue is also the same when we talk about groundwater systems. The way they measure or they map those aquifers is not the same. So this is also an issue where we talk about binational relations, that maybe they may not have the same methodology or way to see the problem, but at least in common issues, in this case, Mexico and United States doesn't have a same or a share or a common methodology to measure pollution or to map aquifers.
I want to explore that national policy aspect for a while. It's interesting that on both sides of the river there are federal systems. So we've talked several times about how state law comes in on this. But I wanted to ask if Mexico has different policies toward rivers on its southern border than it does on its northern border. And then after you answer, Dr. Nava, I'd like to pose the same question about the United States to Dr. Eckstein.
Yes, the situation in the border, in the southern border of Mexico, which is shared with Belize and Guatemala, is very, very different from the relation Mexico has with the United States. And with the United States, Mexico behaves. That's simple as it is. In terms of shared waters with Mexico and Guatemala mainly, there is a very important river, which is a river, a free river. It doesn't have any dams. It's the most important river in Mexico, the Usumacinta River. And despite the fact that this river has pretty much the same organization or governance system, I mean, there is also a water treaty. No, Yes, there is also a water treaty, and there is also an international boundary water commission between Mexico and Guatemala, but the functioning is not exactly the same. So it doesn't work as the IBWC between Mexico and United States is working. So in that case, the south, the border in the south of Mexico has much to learn from the northern border of Mexico, because Mexico doesn't give the same treatment to the rivers share in the south border than in the northern with United States.
As for the U.S. and its northern border with Canada, generally it's a very different regime. It's a different system of allocation, but there is a commission, there are treaties in place, and the relationship is just, I think, as civil on the northern border as it is on the southern border. The U.S. has very good relationship with Mexico and with Canada in terms of the shared waters. With Canada, obviously, we have the Great Lakes, we have the Columbia River, we have all sorts of other rivers crossing the border, and there's a commission. It's structured very differently than IBWC on the northern U.S. border, very differently, but it has a very good track record of cooperation and achieving at least project agreements. There's no amendment system or interpretation system like the minute system, but they do come out with projects and arrangements on different regions of the border in terms of any kind of disputes. And there's been very, very few disputes that have been ongoing, that have been not resolved between US and Canada. So it's a very amicable relationship.
We have another question from a student. This one from the aptly named Tanya River. She writes, what about collaboration by scientists to support the policy improvement and implementation along the river? It's a good question. Is there a role for scientists and science in general in policy along the river?
I will say yes. I think that it's very, very important the role played by academic and scientific specialists. And currently, because mainly of climate change and the situation along the river, the majority of them agrees on the provision of environmental flows in order to recover and sustain both aquatic and riparian ecosystems and water provision for human needs. So yes, of course, there is a very important argument arising from in this scheme from governance, arising from the bottom, from the scientific, from the community to the upper level in order to propose or to formulate recommendations to international policy or international instruments. So that's very important.
Yeah, I fully agree, and I'll give you two examples. One is, as we mentioned, the CILA IBWC. It's a very technocratic organization. They're engineers and scientists who are really running those institutions. And in my mind, and I'm a lawyer, I say keep the lawyers out of this. They are doing a fantastic job because they are resolving disputes on a practical, technical level, not political or legal. Of course, they're doing so within the legality relationship. But so that's one example. Second example, on the US-Mexico border, we now have a non-governmental organization called the Permanent Forum of Binational Waters, which is composed of academics and scientists. I think there's about 150 participants. And it is, I would say, it is responsible for encouraging the IBWC to address new issues like groundwater. And because of this group, I think that the IBWC, and its political components are paying attention to issues that this scientific body is pointing to and saying, we need to deal with groundwater issues. We need to deal with environmental issues, and so they are paying attention to this, and they're doing so. I think really positively, welcoming this kind of interaction with the scientific community.
One thing that's been talked about by scientists recently is the fate of large dams. Many of the dams along the river and on tributaries may have been built some time ago, and they tend to age out in various ways. And I'm wondering if that's a problem along the Rio Grande. And I know that in other areas of the world, there has been some talk, although very little action, about actually removing dams and letting rivers be free rivers, as Luzma described the main river in Mexico as being once again. Do you know if there's any discussion along these lines with regard to the Rio Grande?
Professor Gabriel?
I have not heard that kind of discussion along the Rio Grande, and I don't expect it. Yes, environmental concerns are prominent, but water scarcity is I think the critical concerns, and so reservoirs have been one of the main ways to deal with water management and trying to provide water into the future. You've got a number of main reservoirs too on the lower Rio Grande, Amistad and Falcon. You have Elephant Butte, which is actually entirely inside of New Mexico within the United States, but it stores water that is allocated to Mexico. So keeping those waters in reservoirs, I think, is a priority. And even though some of these, Elephant Butte was built about 100 years ago.
1939, I think.
If not sooner or earlier than that, maybe. But so some of these reservoirs are very old, but they are being maintained, and I don't foresee that they'll be removed anytime soon, because they're a critical part of the infrastructure for water allocation under the growing scarcity, continuing increasing scarcity condition.
They do storage and irrigation, right? Do any of them do hydropower?
Very little. There's very little hydropower on the Rio Grande.
And that's undoubtedly because of the flow issue.
The flow issue and the elevation, trying to find a place where you have adequate elevation for hydropower. It's, yeah.
Luzma, did you have something?
Yes, I just would like to add something to what Professor Gabriel already mentioned, that we must remember and do not forget that the Rio Grande or the Rio Bravo is a river in the desert. It's a very, very arid area. So the dams, those 4 dams that Professor already mentioned, the Elephant Butte, Caballo Dam, Falcon, and Amistad along the international border, are very, very important and crucial to maintain living the life in this area. So it's very, very important, because this river is a magical and mysterious river, because in other circumstances maybe it won't exist anymore.
Yeah. Ambassador Brix, you had a question.
Yes, if I may come in listening to you, I have 2 questions concerning buildings. One is, again, dam building, and the other is bridge building. On the dam issue, you already mentioned that there is little energy production. Normally, in big river issues, you have a contest about the use of energy, which you find even in the Danube constellation in Europe. So that this is not the case obviously in the Rio Grande. Do you see this as part of that there are less problems in common regimes between the 2 sides? And the second question concerns the bridges. Is bridge building part of any of these international regimes, or are these international bridges always done on a bilateral, individual, case-by-case issue? And what about these two questions concerning the Colorado River or the Colorado part, the upside part? Is dam building in the Colorado, in the northern part of the Rio Grande, an issue only for the US or also a common issue?
Yes, I will start with the second question. The international bridge built first between El Paso and Ciudad Juarez, and those also built in the site of California and Baja California in Mexico, and some others are, if I'm not mistaken, under the jurisdiction of the International Boundary Water Commission. So are binational ways to people mobility. And please help me, Professor Gabriel, with the second question, the first question.
The dams? Good. Did you want to respond to that?
Please go ahead.
Yeah. Well, okay. Well, just on the bridges area, bridges issue, the only thing I would add is, yes, it's a binational issue. It's subject to IBWC and sort of federal rules because it is an international boundaries. But don't underestimate the local communities. They are making footbridges. They are making ways to cross the border in ways that we don't see on a day-to-day basis. These communities are really united on the border with family members living on both sides of the borders, and the artificial political boundary that we've created definitely makes it more difficult. But they do have their own bridges, so to speak. As far as the dams, well, first I'll say the Colorado River has to be considered completely separate from the Rio Grande. Because it's, you have a successive river versus a contiguous river. But also I think you're right that the hydropower does play a role, because the need to put water in a reservoir for irrigation purposes is a very different need than for hydropower purposes. And when you have it for hydropower and you need that electricity, and in the Colorado basin, it's supplying electricity for 30 or 40 million people. You need constant power and constant flow through that reservoir. So the way these dams are managed are very different, and so I think it does add an additional layer of stress because in fact on the Colorado, those reservoirs are being run for hydropower, but also for irrigation water, but also for municipal water supplies and recreation. Whereas on the Rio Grande, you don't have the hydropower component. You do have some recreation and irrigation water and a little bit of drinking water as a factor. So I think there's different stressors and priorities and politics involved on the two basins that are very different. So yes.
Yeah. Continuing with the science question, we've touched glancingly on climate change. I know that in North America as a whole, climate change has had this very uneven effect on water. There's too much water in some places, too little in others. What are scientists finding in the Rio Grande Valley? What's happening there?
I would say that different scenarios. In some areas, we will experience higher seasons of dryness, and in other areas, which most closest to the Gulf of Mexico, a higher floods, inundations. So that's all kind of effects of climate change we are experiencing on the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo basin. Yeah.
And just to add to that, you're going to have less snowpack up in the Colorado mountains, so you're going to have less flow. You may have more rainfall in certain times, but that comes down the Rio Grande. But it's not at the times that you expect it, that you want it, at least historically, for agricultural purposes and other uses. And the smaller snowpack means that you're going to have less of a reservoir in the mountains way up north. So this is already threatening the water that is reaching the border in the El Paso Ciudad Juarez area. And in fact, the Elephant Butte if you look at right now at the water levels, they have been consistently at 10 or 15% full. I mean, very little water. I mean, it's just for the last number of years. Yes. If you because they are obligated under the 1906 treaty to store water for Mexico. It's 60,000 acre feet per year, and so they don't release it at one time. They release it at a certain specified times. But under the 1906 treaty, they also, when the amount of water in the upper Rio Grande goes down, they do also reduce the allocation to Mexico. But because they are obligated to provide that water to Mexico, it means less water for people in New Mexico, and the water that reaches that border of El Paso, Ciudad Juarez, and it's just a very minuscule amount of water as compared to the past. Part of it is due to allocations upstream, but part of it is definitely due to climatic changes. And weather patterns and so on.
Are there significant indigenous communities along the river, and do they have any specific rights? Dr. Nava, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, there are 19 pueblos. They are called pueblos, Native Americans in the state of New Mexico in the United States. They are 19 big communities in New Mexico, and they do have pretty much the same rights that the federal that the state. So they are in the legal context of the United States. They are considered as a holders of rights as a state in the United States. So yes, they do have rights on the river, and because they do have rights on the river, they also have a stake on the river. So it's very, very interesting how these 19 pueblos in New Mexico are dealing with water issues within New Mexico and within the Rio Grande Basin. And also in Mexico, the situation is similar. In Chihuahua, for example, there is an important community, which is the Tarahumaras, and they rely on surface water from the Rio Bravo Basin. So because of climate change, also water is having an impact on communities. How do they live? How do they do their daily activities? And now, what do they need to do in order to continue living, to survive? So this implies land change uses, because they might change the crops they were used to grow in that area to other crops that maybe require less water. And another consequence also is that some families might leave their own places where they used to live because there is no more water, so there is no more food, there is no production. So it's also an effect of immigration issues from native areas to urban areas.
If I could change gears just a bit here, many of our students at the Diplomatic Academy aspire to becoming experts in various fields of international law, international politics. And so I'm curious about how you chose water and river management as a specialty that you wanted to go into. How did you develop your interest in this? Dr. Nava, could you speak to that?
Yes. Well, in my case, it was very interesting because I started with my at school at a master's degree. I was interested to know how water is managed in Mexico, and then that subject led me to international waters because I found out that there are rivers shared between Mexico and the United States, and Mexico and Guatemala and Belize. So I thought, what happened with that water? And what happened with that water becomes a border also, because we don't not forget that the Rio Grande Rio Bravo Basin, it is an important international river in the world, but it is also an important section of the border between the United States and Mexico. And when we think about the river as a border in the stricter terms of the word, it is a border that in the in the discourse of the United States and also Mexico, we need to protect, we need to control, because there are some illegal issues crossing along the border. So in that case, the river is not more a river, it's not more a natural resources. It's just a way to connect two countries. And it's exactly the same situation that happens between Mexico and Guatemala. It's a river that runs along the border between Mexico and Guatemala, and also is an area being crossed by people and some other stuff. So that's the reason of my interest on international waters, because water becomes more than water.
Very much so, especially when you start to talk about making a wall there or things like that. I think many Americans were surprised during the crisis last month at Del Rio, Texas, to see people walking casually across the river, walking through the river, which appeared to be less than knee deep, and it was not the barrier that they are often told in the news that it is. Professor Eckstein, tell me about how you got interested in these questions.
Yeah. So my route started very early. My father was actually a professor of hydrogeology, groundwater scientist, and he was both an academic and a practitioner and a consultant. I remember, I ended up with a geology degree because of him. And I started off on the sciences side. My mother is also a chemist, so I started off on the science side. But I was always very interested in the policy and the politics of it, and eventually ended up working on environmental and water issues for master's degrees and also in law degrees, in my law degrees. So it's something that has always been, a foundation, having that science behind me and understanding some of the technical aspects, and then being able to work in the policy realm and the legal realm. That's sort of how I got into it. And in fact, my father and I ended up co-authoring a number of papers, writing from that science and policy and law perspective. That's really been he's been an inspiration to me in terms of the work that I've been doing. So. Mm-hmm.
Does your research take you to the river itself, or do you spend your time in various capitals where law is made?
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't get out to the field as much as I would like to. A lot of this is done at negotiating tables, in offices, and we try to, whenever possible, to take the participants of if I'm involved in any kind of, whether it's dispute resolution, negotiations, or even a conversation over the policy and the politics or the law over a particular river, we try to get those people to go out to that water body, to actually touch it. And it's very often, that's something that they don't even think about. They look at maps, they look at pictures, but to actually go out there is something unique. So I don't get out as much as I would like to. Yeah.
Dr. Nava, am I right in thinking that you work in consultation with the Mexican government on a number of projects? Are you called upon to give advice Are you called upon to give advice to national authorities or state authorities on questions related to the river?
No, not an advice from the, as you say earlier, from the scientific or from academic perspective. Yes, I have had opportunity to participate a few times with the actual federal government, and has been a very interesting experience, because as from one side, and with this answer I would like to go back to the previous question. When I first had the experience to go to the field, I found that too many things, but one very important, that there is a huge difference between theory and practice. What we learn there with the local communities might be very, very different from what we have read at school. So it's a very enriching and rich experience going to the field. And second, having the opportunity to participate with another colleague on water issues here in Mexico with the federal government is also very interesting, because sometimes public or federal officials might not have the actual state of what is being done around the world on water issues. So we, as academic or the scientific area, we might bring those new knowledge to the public policy officers in order to formulate or to adapt the current public policy system.
It's a very good note to end on. I'll give Ambassador Brix the final word, but I want to thank you both for so generously lending your expertise and your time to us today, and for making this chapter in the Big Rivers series a tremendous success. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I add my thank you to all three of you, I have to say. It was fascinating to see that we have an example of Rio Grande, where obviously the water management seems to work actually well in the interest of both sides, and for a long period. We're speaking about 100 years or so. But at the same time, we did not have enough time to talk about these border aspects, which have a different dimension in the public mind, like narcotics, drug, or migration issues. And I wonder, maybe for a next time, to see what your position is on this, whether this is a totally different story, which you, as concentrating on the water management, do not want to be involved in. However, we need sometimes a bit more holistic approach, also your input into this sort of policy discussions. But this is maybe something that Mr. Blinken should discuss tomorrow with the Mexican president. I think he will be in Mexico City tomorrow. So it's not for us to discuss. We are from the Diplomatic Academy. Thank you very much, all three of you. Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.